I was on vacation last week when I got the message, where's your presentation? And so Friday night around midnight, I sent through a PDF. At midnight in Europe, sent through a PDF of my presentation. So again, I'm going to do some apologies in advance, and we'll see how it goes. So on screen right now, rendering of our project, which ultimately, it says 257 there, but ultimately the address was changed to 253 King William Street. It was a parking lot in Hamilton. It is what's classified as a supportive housing. So there's 21 suites. All of the suites are bachelor or studio type units, around just over 350 square feet, something like that. The City Housing Hamilton was the client, and their target was to achieve passive house. The intent was also to have the project delivered on a fast track schedule. And so we had already delivered our firm and projects that I was looking after. We'd already delivered 2 modular projects at the time for the City of Toronto. And so what I'll do is I'll dive in and explain kind of what the modular component is as part of this and why it's kind of unique to the project. But it was seen by City Hamilton Housing as and just through ourselves encouraging it, as a rapid delivery method for this type of housing. So. Okay, someone's got to look into this.
Keyboard will also work.
All right, let me try that.
So that.
There we go. I'll skip. You already know about me. Okay, so I'll start off. What is volumetric modular construction? So if anybody has ever bought an IKEA cabinet and installed it in their house, that is modular in nature. That is modular construction. That's flat pack modular. Full volumetric modular construction is where the entire sort of 3D space from start to finish is constructed off-site and delivered to site. So in this instance, the components, so maybe the walls, the roof, they were essentially flat pack elements that arrived to the factory, and then they were constructed or put together to form a 3-dimensional box. Box was finished on the outside with insulation membranes, on the inside with drywall, and in many cases with the equipment, the refrigerators, the cooktops, the kitchen, and the finished furniture. So this is just a sort of sense of the site at 253 King William. This is pre-construction parking lot. City Hamilton Housing is the client. And then just to set some context just on that site, this is the floor plan that we came up with. So this is a ground floor plan. In total, as I say, 21 suites, but what you can see here is a sort of a typical sort of suite arrangement, which was kitchen, washroom, and actually, incidentally, it was really good that Josh kind of pre-prepped my conversation, because mechanically it was serviced exactly how Josh described it. So I don't have to sort of do a terrible job of presenting the mechanical components of this building. So what is the volumetric modules that we used on this site? So you can see off on the right-hand side here, we have one module which is about 65 feet long, about between 10 foot wide on the right, where you see the electrical room and the stairs, 14 foot wide on the left, where you've got the elevator module with the stairs and mechanical room, which was necessarily larger, and then the studio suites themselves were about 12 foot wide. So the module, as you can see, is back to back there. You've got studio, corridor, studio. When it's all wrapped up for transportation, you just see a finished kind of, or just a one white box. But the corridor is open, and so they're sort of interconnected, and that presents a whole slew of challenges, especially when you get into a centralized system, when you're trying to interconnect mechanical, electrical components down the corridor to service each of the suites. So I'll chat a little bit about that, and then if there's any sort of more deep dive questions afterwards, I'm happy to take them as we walk around. This is not the passive house project, but I wanted to just let people in on sort of a window into the production process. for full volumetric modular. So top left, I'll just race through these really quickly. Top left is just a module construction process in the shop. The modular provider that we worked with is NRB Modular Solutions, and they've recently been purchased by a company called Atco, based out in Alberta. But you can see the flat pack stack of walls and floor and ceiling arrive. We documented those up independently. They went to a modular provider that just produced the walls and were delivered then to NRB, where they set them up. You can see the top right, the drywall is being added to the walls before they get stacked. Again, you're working at a sort of a more easy to construct height. You see they've set it up on tables for installing the drywall and finishing the drywall here. Center photo, start of the process of stacking those walls in place. Photo on the right. Interestingly, what you're able to do with this is we were using modular shower units that get the acrylic kind of enclosed on three sides, and so this was the point when we would sort of half of the modules up that they would get dropped in, so you weren't kind of hauling them through doors and upstairs and everything else in the building process. So they got dropped in. The completed rough framing on the bottom there. Center photo in the middle is where they have these Bluetooth connected lifts. They're able to lift up the modules and do all the mechanical work on the underside at a safe working height, and you can just see an image of that mechanical install on the bottom. Picking up again then as we just advance it further, you can see washroom plumbing work kind of in progress on the underside. And then I might have some other photographs later of this on the passive house one, but you can see in the ceiling in the corridor where we've got some of the sprinkler line connections and they're just plugged at the end or stopped at the ends, and the interconnection between the modules is made on the site. The kitchen plumbing wall on the right hand side for the bachelor suites, again all basically prepped in the shop and in the factory and finished out. This particular unit, the servicing was PTAX. They're not super efficient, but the project that I'm showcasing kind of as an example of the build has just had those. So we've got a very different centralized ventilation system in the passive house project. Window install, we had various mock-ups, and ultimately then we're able to get all the windows installed in the shop, and then you just see the finishing out process and ultimately handover. So that's just the building of a modular project in the factory. So for this particular project, so taking all that kind of modular process and looking at our volumetric modular passive house project, what were kind of some of the constraints that we had to consider? So the insulation and the module sizes. So prior to working on this project, we had developed two volumetric modular projects for the City of Toronto. The requirements in terms of performance were not as stringent as passive house. The amount of insulation, particularly the amount of outboard insulation that was required, was significantly less for those projects. For transportation of full volumetric modular projects, there's a lot of kind of nuances to that in terms of permits that can drive the cost of the project. And so for us to put a lot of outboard insulation on the projects meant that we were going over a certain dimension size that basically necessitated police escort for the modules to be delivered to site and specific permits that drove up the cost. And so we had a lot of like gymnastics around how to make reductions there. And so we ultimately ended up with just one 14-foot module, which was the stair and elevator and mechanical room module, and all the rest we were able to condense them down, the width down, so they didn't require that police escort. Centralized versus non-centralized services. So Josh gave a really great presentation on the benefits of centralized. Works really, really well on what I'll call a site-built building as opposed to a factory-built building or a modular project. In this instance, we had to do a lot of sort of coordinating of the services such that it could be terminated. They could be constructed in the shop and terminated at the corridors. But the suites were all finished, but there was still some interconnections. We had to leave the ceilings of the washrooms open to finish out the connections to the VRF and fan coil units and that. Air tightness, some of the tricky components for that is the membranes were installed in the factory, but you then have to structurally connect all the various modules together, put the interconnect the membranes over top of that, finish out the insulation in those gaps. You'll see some pictures in a few moments of just how that went together. But ultimately, with Passive House, you can't just test a module individually. You need to deliver, to get your certification, ultimately you're delivering a whole building airtightness test. The next thing is material sourcing during the pandemic. So this was, we were awarded this contract right on the tail end of the pandemic. And I think everyone knows at that stage, just sourcing materials was absolutely impossible. And especially the client was saying, there's a shortage of housing, folks. We need this project delivered fast. And we were looking at, we can't get windows. They're just, Passive House windows just are not available right now. Centralized ERVs not available. And so we had a long list of kind of orders that had to happen like as soon as the contract was awarded. Windows, instead of being able to source them locally, we ended up getting them from Germany. And that had its own issues, which I'll sort of get into in a bit more detail. And then the last thing is just, the last major challenge was trying to find trades and the modular provider, trying to get them upskilled and get them to understand the demands of Passive House. And the one thing that I keep preaching to people as I do talks like this is that Passive House it's really, in terms of like build quality, it's in our drawings and our specifications, our standard drawings and specifications. We just weren't following through on the quality, and the contractors and trades weren't following through on the quality necessary for Passive House to achieve certification. And so it's a wonderful tool. So even if projects aren't necessarily looking for the absolute certification, but are shadowing the Passive House process, you're still getting a better building. This is the targets. We actually, so heating demand 11, heating load 8. We actually were right on point with all of these except for the air tightness. We came in at 0.3 for the air tightness, so we were pretty happy with that ultimately. There was a lot of work it was quite difficult to manage in the volumetric modular build process. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about some of the details. So this is the external wall. We have it's a wood frame building, dimensional lumber. So we were able to take advantage of vapor barrier on the inside, air barrier on the outside. Majority outboard insulation. The wall, we tested kind of the dew point. But one of the products that we sourced to meet the demands of the schedule, because insulation was very hard to get in the latter part of the pandemic and sort of the early phases out of the pandemic. This really interesting product, thermal wall by a company called Legolit. It's basically a thermal bridge-free product because the track that gets fixed to the that fixes basically the insulation through the sheathing, and then ultimately you're cladding through the insulation. You've got this central track, which you can see on the left there, that just slots in. This portion here is screwed into the wall, and then the strapping is screwed into that track. And so there's really no connection from inside to outside, but for the screw. This is some of the wall build-up kind of drawings that we set up from starting off with. We put these together so that to help with that process of education for the modular builder and the trades about the order of building. So for everything from the membranes in the center at the bottom, how we wanted the insulation to be, the order of stacking it to sort of reduce any sort of penetrations through insofar as possible, the strapping drawings at the top, and then ultimately the cladding, the standing seam cladding on the right. These are sort of demonstration drawings just to talk about the sequence. There's obviously much greater detail in other kind of elements of the package. So managing the air tightness. So one of the sort of problems that we have is that each module arrives on site, membranes are wrapped, vapor barrier on the inside, air barrier on the outside, but you need to make connections between those. So there's a structural component to it, the connection, which is basically this, it's as simple as this piece of plywood here, but there's some very strict nailing patterns for that plywood to meet with to get the structural kind of integrity in place. And then we had to lap membranes over that. So we had to hold the insulation back by about maybe 6 or 8 inches on either side. In this instance, we had a window kind of right up against it. So this particular detail was pretty intricate, but holding that insulation back, and then that insulation got installed on site, which meant that we had to leave off a lot of the cladding. We typically like to do as much of the cladding as possible in the factory, but we had to hold the cladding off. I wanted to talk a little bit, about the windows. One of the things with the windows that I strongly recommend when you are looking into, we had a lot of pressure to get windows on this job on time, but it's not enough, in my view, to have your window CSA A440 certified. There's a lot of stricter water and air testing to meet the passive house requirements that has to be in place. This is just an image of all the services terminated in the corridor. So this is just one of the units where you can see some of the ductwork and some of the domestic hot and cold water feeds. On the mechanical side, we just use CO2 heat pump for the domestic hot water, air-cooled chiller, VAV boxes and fan coils, the centralized ERV. We had some solar PV on the roof offsetting some of the electrical load, and then LED lighting, but just meeting the IES standard. So some photos then of the build itself. So this is the below grade works with the insulating. You need that continuous sort of line of insulation and continuous membrane around. So that's a shot of that. This is the actual passive house modules in the factory. So between the modules, so this is the exposed face that would receive the cladding, and the major portions of the insulation and the standing seam cladding, but between the modules themselves, we also had acoustic performance requirements, so you can see the bat insulation there. The window testing itself, because the windows that we ordered did meet CSA A440, so we were thrilled that we got these on site, but when we went to do our testing of the windows, they just kept failing, just over and over and over, and we kept having to bring the manufacturer back to tweak the gaskets, tweak the hinges and up the pressure on it. We eventually passed them all, but we ended up doing tests on every single one of the windows. So that was a real headache that we overcame, but it was one of those things where I think had we more options for window manufacturers and more time, we might have asked more questions on that. So it was a big lesson for us. This is just looking at the build in the factory. So the membranes in place, windows in place. Then we start off with you can see some of the insulation and the strapping in place. Inside the suite, you see the kitchen and drywall almost completely finished out. Ultimately, like I say, the microwaves, the fridges, the chairs, the beds, everything were all in the suites prior to delivery. This is an image on site then, after the modules were stacked, so you can see these spaces that were generated in between to allow the structural interconnection, and then we had to lap the membranes over the top. The pitched roof was actually entirely site-built, modular in its own right in that we used the prefabricated wood trusses, but not full volumetric modular. Another site photo then, just showing the part cladding of the standing seam. Solar PV on the roof, and then some finished shots. I realize I've got a very short amount of time. So I've got some finished photos here. This is just after handover. The rear garden space at the back. This is sort of a public space within or amenity space for the residents, and one of the suites. And then a last parting shot of the exterior. And thank you very much.